Welcome to Smart Decisions in a Complex World. My name is Scott Campbell, and I am the president of Core Factors. And I'm delighted that you have decided to join me in this webinar today as we talk about how we can make smart decisions in what is an increasingly complex world. I believe that the ability to make smart decisions on a consistent basis is the single most important skill that an executive must possess. Why do I say that? Well, quite simply because decisions determine destiny. The level of success that we obtain is directly related to the quality of the decisions that we make. One thing that I've learned over the years in working with executives is that often, although they may not admit this publicly, in our private conversations, often they will talk about the sense of being alone that they have because they bear responsibility for major decisions that have a direct impact on the organization and its success, as well as the employees whom they lead. And oftentimes it's helpful to have someone alongside, an outside voice, if you will, to help you navigate the rough seas of business decisions in today's complex and uncertain world. Today, I hope I can be that voice and be that individual alongside you as we talk about how to make better decisions. Why are you here today? Well, there could be several reasons. Some of you may have an immediate, critical decision that must be made in a very short time frame, and you're looking for some tools that can help you make the best decision possible under that time pressure. Others of you may be thinking longer term, and you want to ensure that in the coming months and years that you're able to make good strategic decisions. And you're looking for ideas and tools that will help you in that pursuit of being able to make consistently smart strategic decisions. Still, others of you may be here because you're frustrated with a current decision that you're trying to make. It may be that your team is experiencing communication difficulties. There may be a lot of politics going on, or people are bringing their personal agendas. Could be that roles and responsibilities aren't clear. Whatever the cause, you're frustrated with the process in which you're involved, and you're looking for some ideas and approaches that can help you move that process along in a more effective way. Whatever the reason, I want you to take a moment and imagine yourself feeling more in control because you have a solid process that is going to guide you towards a high-quality decision, and more confident because you know that you're going to make a really smart decision, whatever the situation that you're facing. That's what I hope you will move toward as a result of your participation in this webinar today. It's never been easy to make smart decisions on a consistent basis, but it is tougher now than ever. Recently, I conducted a survey of approximately 200 business leaders and entrepreneurs in which I was asking them various questions about decision-making in today's business climate. Overwhelmingly, respondents indicated that it is significantly harder to make business decisions today than just 10 years ago even. And when I followed up and asked them why they said that, the number one reason that was given was the increased complexity of the world in which leaders must make decisions. In accounting for this increase in complexity, these leaders cited such factors as the globalized network in which business now operates, constant technological innovation, instant worldwide communication, real-time access to information by consumers, the impact of social media on company reputation, for good and in particularly troubling for ill, the challenges created by virtual workforces, often which are dispersed globally, and finally, the incredible speed at which today's organizations must operate. I suppose that even with the increased complexity of today's decision-making climate, you might think that with the large number of decisions that leaders make day in, day out, that they are nonetheless quite skilled at making good decisions. You might think that. Unfortunately, you'd be wrong. In fact, the hard truth is that organizational leaders tend not to be good at making highly effective decisions on a consistent basis. That's a pretty bold claim. So you might be asking, well, what kind of evidence do you have that supports such a statement? Well, let me give you several pieces of evidence. One very powerful proof for that statement is a massive study of senior leaders and their decision-making effectiveness that was conducted by Paul C. Nutt. Nutt is the emeritus professor at Fisher College of Business at Ohio State University. And over a period of 20 years, he analyzed 400 decisions that were made by senior leaders in private, public, and nonprofit organizations in the United States, in Canada, and across Europe. Nutt was trying to determine the success and the failure rate of these decisions. How many decisions actually obtained the outcomes that they were intended to create? Well, shockingly, Nutt discovered that 50%, half of all the decisions that these senior leaders made, failed to achieve the intended results. Now, that's decisions made by senior leaders whom we might expect to have much more experience and skill in making decisions. That study and its results are confirmed in other kinds of statistics that we know about various aspects of organizational life. Take the world of mergers and acquisitions. It's been known for a long time that most mergers and acquisitions fail to achieve the intended profits for shareholders that is motivating the decision either to merge or to acquire another company. In fact, research suggests that 75% of mergers and acquisitions never pay off. Or consider new business ventures, startups. The sad reality here is that approximately 80% of new business ventures fail within the first 3 years. Or consider manufacturing. When we look at the success rates of new manufacturing plants, 70% of them close within the first decade of their operation. Consider the success rate of companies entering new markets, either geographically or in terms of new products. And again, the failure rate is a stunning 75%. These statistics suggest that the claim that I made before, that leaders have difficulty in making consistent, smart decisions, certainly is true. However, more important than considering the results of other people's decisions, chances are that if you honestly examine the results of your own decisions, you'll have to acknowledge that many of them failed to achieve their intended outcomes. So, what are we to do? How can we improve our ability to make smart decisions on a consistent basis? What's the key to making smart decisions in this world of increased complexity and uncertainty? The key is to have an effective decision-making process that blends rigorous analysis, creative thinking, and intuitive insight, and which leads to a really smart decision. The truth is, you already have a decision-making process with which you are comfortable. For most individuals with whom I've worked, the process that they use is both unconscious and uncalculated, rather than conscious and carefully constructed. So it's not about whether you have a process for making decisions. The question rather is, how good is your process? Where is it strong and where is it lacking? What can you do to improve it? Based on extensive research, formal study, and my years of experience as an executive coach and consultant, I've created a 7-step process that, when followed, guides an individual or a team to a high-quality, smart decision. Today, I'd like to give you a brief overview of that process. And although there is much more to be said about each of these 7 steps, I want to give you practical information in the time that we have together today that you can use immediately to start making even smarter decisions. So let's turn to the first step of the process, choosing the optimal frame for the decision. If you're near a window, take a look through it. What you see is dictated by the window frame. It focuses your attention on certain realities, and it blocks you from seeing others. Similarly, how you mentally frame the decision that you're facing determines what you will pay attention to, what you prioritize, what you consider irrelevant information, what you consider relevant information, and what you believe your options to be. For many reasons, choosing the most strategically advantageous frame is the first and most critical step in the process of making a really smart decision. If we get it wrong here, or if we choose to frame the decision in a less than optimal manner, it affects everything else in the process. Unfortunately, it's the part of most individual or team decision-making processes that most leaders rush by. Now, framing a decision involves 2 things. One is how you conceive of the actual issue that is prompting the need for a decision. And second, how you formulate in words the actual decision that needs to be made. Let me illustrate. Let's say that your organization has the largest market share in your industry. 8 years ago, the leadership team set a target of achieving an annual 15% increase in profits. And for the past 7 years, the organization has either achieved or even exceeded those targets. However, over the last 3 fiscal quarters, profits have only grown by 4%. How would you frame what it is you need to make a decision about in this situation? What exactly is the issue, and how would you define what is the actual decision to be made? Well, one possible frame, the one most people would probably assume is the optimal one, would be, how do we get back on track, continuing our 15% annual growth in profits? But is that the most strategically advantageous frame? Is it the optimal frame? What if we frame the decision as, is the 15% annual growth rate still desirable for our organization? Or we could frame it as, should we consider selling the company while we're still in a position of market share strength? You can see that these are 3 very different frames, and they will lead to very different discussions, options, and choices. And thus, choosing the most strategically advantageous frame is the first and most critical step in the process of making a smart decision. There are numerous other benefits gained by taking the time to choose the optimal frame, particularly in team settings. Creating a common decision frame helps subordinate individual and departmental agendas. It often surfaces hidden assumptions of individuals and the whole team. And it provides focus for keeping the conversation on track, keeping it from meandering off onto side issues or lower priorities. These are reasons why I say choosing the optimal frame is the most important step in the process. One tool that many groups and individuals find helpful in guiding the conversation around choosing the most strategically advantageous frame is known as the decision hierarchy. The hierarchy is composed of 3 elements, top, middle, and bottom. The top of the hierarchy involves those things that are going to be assumed as givens, such as policies or corporate goals, relevant laws and regulations, or directives from higher up in the organization. The bottom of the hierarchy concerns the things that we are going to defer to later to make decisions about. Could be matters of tactical implementation or simply secondary decisions that are dependent upon the primary decision. It's the middle section of the hierarchy where the decision is framed in an optimal manner. In the example I was just speaking of, it would be important to decide if the target of a 15% annual growth in profit is a given, or is it up for grabs as part of the discussion around the decision frame? In other words, does it rest in the top segment of the hierarchy, or is it in the middle zone, and it could be part of the discussion that leads to the decision frame? On the other hand, issues around how to change sales commissions or how much to increase the marketing budget would reside in the bottom section of the hierarchy and thus would not be a part of the conversation around choosing the decision-making frame. Once an optimal frame has been chosen, the process moves on to the second step, creating SMART objectives. Whereas choosing the frame tells you what the decision is about, your objectives tell you what you want to achieve through that decision. Your objectives are your decision criteria, and they tell you whether or not you're making the smartest decision possible. They are what allow you to evaluate your alternatives, determine what information you'll need, and assess the quality of your ultimate decision. In the same manner that many leaders rush through or omit altogether a discussion about how best to frame the decision, many of us spend a minimal amount of time in creating the smartest objectives possible for a decision. We often assume that the objectives are obvious and thus end up with decisions that are either too narrow or too broad, too short-term or too long-term, or they end up causing more problems than they actually solve. Let me use this scenario to illustrate a few key points about creating SMART objectives. Let's say your company has been growing rapidly ever since starting it 5 years ago. You currently have 150 employees, and you're facing a decision about how to accommodate more staff, more equipment, and greater inventory capacity. Now, as you see it, the decision frame is this. Should you lease the space next door in your office complex, which is soon going to become available, and then renovate it? Or should you move to a new space that has a design that would require minimal adjustments? How would you go about creating SMART objectives for this decision? What principles would you use to do that? One principle is to distinguish carefully between strategic objectives and tactical objectives. To set an objective such as determine the cost of square footage in both locations is a tactical objective, not a strategic one. It might be necessary as a step in the process of evaluating alternatives down the road, but it's not useful as an objective for early in the process. A better objective, and one which is strategic, might be keep cost of expansion below $400,000. There are multiple ways to do that, and the cost of square footage is only one factor to be considered. So when thinking about your objectives, to make them truly SMART, make sure that you focus on strategic objectives, not tactical ones, at this stage in the process. A second principle is to consider both tangible and intangible factors. Choosing to focus only on tangible factors, such as financial cost or production capacity or technology, runs the risk of creating a narrow decision that fails to truly advance the company. Including instead such intangible factors such as the level of satisfaction and engagement of your staff, or your reputation in the community. These factors take into account important elements that could actually make or break your decision. In fact, one organization I know that did choose to relocate its facilities failed to account for the fact that most of their current staff lived nearby, and their commute time was short. The company relocated to an area where the majority of their staff now had at least a 1-hour commute. Within a year, they had lost 20% of their employees, and that included their VP of operations, who had opposed the decision all along. He decided to retire rather than face the stress of a long and tedious drive to work every day. Had this organization included an intangible objective such as maintain or deepen the current level of employee satisfaction, they might have chosen a different alternative and avoided the financial costs and productivity losses they experienced with such a high employee turnover. A third principle in choosing SMART objectives is to consider both the short-term and the long-term. In the scenario that I have been describing, you would want to balance minimizing or ideally even eliminating any disruption to current levels of production, sales, and customer satisfaction. In other words, a short-term objective. You would want to balance that with creating the capacity to maintain growth for the next 5 years, let's say, without another renovation or relocation project, which is a much longer-term objective. Focusing only on one or the other could well get you into trouble, either now or down the road. There's a lot more to be said about how to create SMART objectives that lead to really smart decisions. But even just using the 3 principles I've given you here will go a long way to improving the quality of the objectives that you set for your decision. One last thing before we progress to the third step of the process. Although I am presenting the process in a linear fashion, the reality is sometimes messier. Sometimes working on one step triggers a realization that you need to go back to earlier steps and rework the process. This is not uncommon when creating SMART objectives. In the example I've been using about whether to lease the space next door and renovate or move to a new location, a discussion of what you want the decision to achieve may prompt a realization that you have not framed the decision adequately. In fact, a better frame might be, how can we best sustain ongoing growth? Framing the decision that way opens up many new alternatives rather than just the 2 that you have been considering. All right, we've looked at the first and second steps in the process. Choose the optimal frame and create SMART objectives. Let's move now to the third step. Involve the right people in the process. Whether you're making an individual decision or a team decision, in most cases you'll want to include other people in the process. The more complex the decision, the more uncertainty that is involved in the outcomes, the more important it is to include others. Involving others can happen on either a formal or informal basis. At times it may be sufficient to meet with someone for coffee for a casual discussion of some aspect of the decision. At other times, you'll want to request their participation in a more structured and systematic manner. Sometimes you'll want to recruit them to be part of the entire decision-making process. At other times, you'll only need their participation at specific stages. So what type of individuals should you consider involving? There are 4 primary categories of individuals to consider involving in your decision-making. First, there are those who have a different perspective than yours about the issue. There's a lot of truth in the proverb that birds of a feather flock together. It's all too easy to surround ourselves only with people who share a similar outlook to us on an issue. And while doing so makes discussions easier, it also makes decisions riskier. In fact, a significant body of research exists that demonstrates that groups that are more diverse achieve better results than more homogeneous ones. While it can be uncomfortable to consider someone whose perspective differs from yours significantly, their perceptions and their priorities can push your thinking to make sure that you've explored important factors that you might have minimized or even overlooked. So, consider involving people with different personality types than your own, people who come from a different department or a different level in the organization than yours, or people who have different professional backgrounds than yours altogether. A second category of people who are often crucial to include are those who possess content expertise concerning the issue about which you're making a decision. The more complexity and uncertainty involved in a significant decision, the more important it is to check with content experts about key facets of the issues under discussion. Let me mention one important caveat, however. There's much evidence that suggests that experts are far better at analysis of current dynamics than they are at predicting probabilities and outcomes. So if you are seeking expertise to help you assess probabilities, make sure that you ask several experts to see if there is a consensus about the likelihood of events and particular outcomes occurring. A third group of people that you'll almost always want to include are those with responsibilities for the implementation of the decision. Years ago, I came across the expression, "A decision that is imposed is a decision that is opposed." Margaret Wheatley, a leadership expert, puts it somewhat differently. She says, "People only support what they create." One of the most common reasons why decisions fail to achieve their intended outcomes is that they're implemented poorly, or not at all, by those who are responsible for doing so. One of the most powerful factors in combating that problem is to gain the participation of key people who will be involved in the implementation of the decision. Participation fosters commitment. One last category of individuals to consider involving in your decision-making is those who are skilled at facilitating the decision-making process itself. It's often very difficult to maintain a focus on the process when you're emotionally and intellectually deeply engaged in the issue on the table. So, the more complexity involved in the issue, the more uncertainty involved in the outcomes, and the more that the consequences matter to you, the more beneficial it is to utilize the services of someone who's an expert in guiding others through the process of making the smartest decision possible. So let me ask you to think about a significant decision that you are facing. Whom do you want to involve whose perspective differs from yours? Whose content expertise you require? Who will be responsible for implementing the decision? And who can guide you through the decision-making process itself? Let's take a moment just to step back and review where we are in the smart decision process. Having framed the decision in an optimal manner, having created smart objectives, and having gained the involvement of the right people, you're now ready for the fourth step of the process: clarify your context. Recently, I was involved in assisting an organization in creating a 2-day sales training program for its national sales team. The sales force had not met its targets for the last couple of years, and earlier training had not rectified the situation. Not too far into our discussions, the senior leaders of the sales team made the decision that they were going to mystery shop each of their locations to see what was really going on in their sales process. I thought this is a great idea. It would generate some very useful hard data. Only there was a problem. They wanted me to create the training curriculum before they had the results of the mystery shopping. There was a presumption that the results of the mystery shopping would merely confirm their understanding about why sales were not at the levels they wanted, and it would simply give them specific numbers that they could then share with their sales associates. In my consultation with them, I continued to push them to consider delaying the development of the training until they had the actual data. I suggested that until we had that data, we didn't even know if a national sales training program was the best method of dealing with the problem. However, they remained confident that their understanding about the problems would simply be borne out by the data. So I acquiesced and I helped them create a training program that worked with their assumptions. I heard back from them a few weeks after their summer training was underway. The report was that the training was going very well. People loved the curriculum that I had created. However, when I inquired about the mystery shopping results, the conversation took a different turn. The results of the mystery shopping revealed problems with their sales process and their sales consultants that were even deeper than what was expected. And they had come to realize that training alone was not going to be sufficient. In fact, they now realize that they should be putting their emphasis and their money into developing their sales managers, not in training their sales consultants. My point in telling you this story is not to say, I tried to tell them in a, smug consultant kind of way. It's rather to emphasize the point that we need to determine what's really going on before we generate options. That might seem rather obvious, but all too often, in my experience in working with leadership teams, they often assume that they know all the relevant data that they need to about the circumstances surrounding the decision they are facing. Well, the fourth step in the process says, don't assume, find out. I call this step clarifying your context. Clarifying the context answers the question, what is really going on? You want to explore the circumstances carefully, looking for data wherever and whenever possible, rather than depending on assumptions, impressions, and opinions. The context of your decision usually involves both internal realities and external realities that need to be clarified. What is going on outside of the organization that is relevant to the issue and the decision that you are facing? And what's going on within the organization that is relevant and germane to the decision that you must make? This is an area where you will likely find it extremely helpful to go to your content experts. But even with them, always be asking, where's the evidence? Where's the data? How do we know this is really the situation? Once you've determined more explicitly the context of your decision, and you have a better understanding of the dynamics, both internal and external to your organization, it's time to start looking at your options. That's step 5 of the process. Generate creative options. Your options represent the range of actions you could take to achieve your objectives. What we're looking for in particular in this step is creative thinking that generates creative options. Such thinking is not easy. It's hard work to think of new and different ways of achieving something. But smart decision makers make the effort. They don't settle for the easy or the obvious. They push for the truly creative. I suppose it's important to note that creative options are not those that are fanciful, impractical, or unrealistic. Rather, they are options that are innovative, uncommon, and clever. They are smart because they achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. As you start to generate possible actions, push yourself by seeking to discover options that fully meet all of your objectives. You may not be able to achieve that. It may not be possible. I'll be talking in a few minutes about the role that trade-offs between options play in decision making. But don't settle too quickly for just good enough. When we try to come up with options, we quickly become aware of the constraints that confine our range of possible actions. Don't assume that the constraints you initially see are actual constraints. Challenge your assumptions. Not all perceived constraints are real constraints. Many times there are self-imposed limits that are the results of our unchallenged assumptions and erroneous beliefs. One simple example of this involves the new home that my wife Elizabeth and I recently moved to. We were married last year, and she ended up moving into my home in Toronto, the city where we both live. Unfortunately, with my house came a 1-hour, 15-minute commute to work for her each way. We began a discussion about where we could move that would work for both of us. So we each created a list of objectives that we wanted our new location to achieve. One of Elizabeth's was to find a place with a maximum 30-minute commute time. That would mean living somewhere in downtown Toronto. One of my objectives was to find a place that had a decent-sized backyard, as I loved working outside as much as possible during our warm months, which aren't many in Toronto, but I also value my private space. The constraint that I saw was the fact that houses in downtown Toronto that have yards bigger than postage stamps were way outside of our price range. It took some creative thinking on my part to realize that whereas I had been telling myself and others for years that I need a backyard where I can work outside, what I really needed was a large space outside where I could work. It was the being outside part in a private space that was really important, not the backyard itself. Once that became clear to me, it widened our options, and it allowed us to find a beautiful large flat in an old Victorian-style home downtown that has 2 large balconies where I can work. Elizabeth did some creative thinking, and she planted cedars around the edge of one of the balconies to create my private space. And I love it. So don't assume that the constraints you initially see are constraints in reality. They may only be in your mind. Where you do have genuine constraints, you will need to think creatively about ways that you could get around them. For example, if you really can't afford to hire a new employee, can you find an intern from a college or university nearby who would find the on-the-job learning valuable enough to work without pay? Could you use someone overseas who could do the work virtually for you at a much less expensive rate? Could you streamline the workflow of people to free up more time in their schedule and then distribute the extra work around the team? Look for options that work around the constraint, especially options that end up achieving other objectives at the same time. Generating creative options often requires solitary time. We often need time to let things incubate mentally before creative possibilities emerge. At the same time, bouncing ideas off of a group of people can sometimes generate ideas that an individual would not come up with on their own. And often we need both time to let ideas incubate and free-flowing discussion to get the best ideas on the table. One last comment about generating creative options. This step, the 5th in the SMART decision process, is another example of where the process is not always linear. As you move into step 6, conducting a sound analysis, you often find that the analysis itself generates new possible actions. So don't assume that once you have left step 5 behind, you have left it behind for good. Stay open to smarter options as you move ahead. Once you've discovered multiple creative options, it's time to start evaluating them with rigor. I refer to this evaluative component of the process as sound analysis, and it is step 6 in the process. There are 2 key elements in conducting sound analysis. 1, establishing an option's feasibility, and 2, establishing its utility. Let's look at each of these briefly. By feasibility, I mean simply, can it actually be done? Some of the ideas generated in step 5 may sound great on the surface, but once we begin to probe, we realize it can't be done. Either we don't have the material resources, or the human resources, or the time. Or perhaps it is simply impossible to do. The sound analysis phase of the process is where you will often draw upon the experts whom you identified and recruited in step 3. Their expertise is often crucial to perform a reality check to see if an option can in fact be implemented, and whether or not there are any major downsides to a particular option that have not been considered. One word of caution when determining the feasibility of an alternative. Don't assume too quickly that something can't be done. It's easy to shoot down an idea as impractical or impossible, when in fact, there might be a way to do it. Sound analysis does not mean you and your experts don't stretch your thinking to see if there are new and creative ways to implement an idea. Sound analysis includes both pragmatism and open-mindedness. A great example of this is the practice of vertical farming. Most of us would assume that growing fruit and vegetables in quantities large enough to feed a city would require a vast area of farmland out in the country. Vertical farms are successfully challenging that idea. Vertical farming involves growing food inside a skyscraper, or even on the sides of buildings. Now, renovating or building a skyscraper so that it becomes a vegetable farm may sound fanciful, but it's happening. And it has huge potential to aid with the challenges of feeding a growing world population. Vertical farms can provide local food on a mass scale. This is a vivid example of a creative option from step 5 that might have first sounded crazy, but upon true sound analysis, with an open mind, it turned into a breakthrough in food supply practices. So that's the feasibility aspect of sound analysis. Let's consider the other aspect, utility. Utility concerns how comprehensive any particular alternative is in terms of achieving the objectives that you established in step 2. It asks, what will a particular option actually accomplish? It also involves checking to see whether a particular option actually contradicts one of your objectives. That doesn't mean necessarily that you won't go for that particular option. It may mean that you decide that that is still the best alternative from amongst the options you have developed, and that you simply won't be able to fully achieve all of your objectives. Often, it means that you need to think about combining options in a creative fashion in order to achieve all of your desired objectives. Let me give you an example. Let me tell you the story of a woman whom I'll call Martha. Martha lives in New York, and she needed to decide whether or not to accept a promotion that would involve a 2-year assignment in Auckland, New Zealand. She and her husband discussed the situation, and they came up with 4 objectives related to that decision. The first, to give their children a rich cross-cultural experience before they finish high school. A second, to cause a minimal disruption in their children's social ties, since they both have a very strong network of friends who are all really good kids. Third objective, to maintain a family income that would allow their children to go to good universities. And finally, a fourth objective, to have Martha continue to advance in her much-loved profession. Based on those objectives, Martha and her husband then generated 4 options. Option 1, Martha, her husband, and their 2 high school-aged children moved to New Zealand for the 2-year assignment. Option 2, Martha moves alone, and the family plans 2 6-week vacations in New Zealand during that time. The third option they came up with, Martha and her husband both move, since he's certain he can work virtually with the bulk of his clients, and their kids live with Martha's mom in New York for the 2 years, and they come to New Zealand for summer vacations. And the fourth option they came up with, Martha turns down the offer and continues to look for other career advancing opportunities in her company or elsewhere. Looking at the utility of these 4 options would involve comparing each to the 4 objectives that Martha and her husband established earlier. How would each option fit with those 4 objectives, some of which might actually seem to contradict each other? Could they combine their options in a meaningful way to achieve all 4 objectives? That's what establishing the utility of the creative options someone has generated involves. Occasionally, you will find one single option achieves all of your objectives. Not really in the case that we are describing. So sometimes it means trading off some of what you hoped to achieve to get the best alternative possible from the options that you have generated. Often, though, it involves finding creative ways to merge aspects of the options that you've generated to create a solution that achieves everything you desire. Once again, you can see how the smart decision process is not really linear. Often, at this stage, as you're establishing the utility of the as you're establishing the utility of the options you have generated, more and better options arise, and the sound analysis phase must be done again with those new options. In this situation, ultimately, Martha and her family ended up with this decision. She moved to New Zealand. Her husband and kids came over for a 6-month school exchange program that they discovered during the sound analysis phase. Martha negotiated a 4-week vacation during which she came back to New York, and her kids and husband came back for 2 months during their kids' summer vacation in the second year of Martha's assignment. What I think is a very smart decision. In fact, that's the very final step of the process. Make a smart decision. This step might seem rather obvious and unnecessary to state, but there are many times that I've seen individuals and teams do all the work of getting to the decision point and then pull back, fearful of making a final commitment to a specific course of action. That isn't being judicious. It's being chicken. Often, people need to be reminded that delaying a decision is in itself a decision. And if you've done due diligence in the early steps of the process, it's rarely a smart decision to make. I've also seen several situations where people have gone along with a decision without fully committing to it. They didn't voice their concerns or objections during the process, and you only discover their lack of commitment to the decision when they fail to implement it wholeheartedly. Or worse, they seek to undermine it. When things get tough during the implementation, as often happens, these individuals are the ones who start telling others, "I tried to tell them this was a bad idea, but they wouldn't listen to me." So in this final step of the process, what we're looking for is a commitment to the decision on the part of all parties involved. This can be done using several tools. One simple one is called the gradient of commitment. And it's a tool that I have found immensely helpful in getting people to voice their level of commitment and then to work on any existing problems that remain that would keep individuals from being fully committed to the decision. The gradient of commitment involves having everyone assign a number from 1 to 10 as to their level of commitment to the decision, along with their rationale for that number. The team then goes one by one in explaining the number that they have assigned. This is a simple but effective means of surfacing any unresolved issues that would keep someone from being highly committed to the decision. It also forces people to go public with their commitment, making it harder for them not to follow through. It builds more accountability. Once the decision has been made, it's time to start with the implementation process. No doubt some aspects of this will have surfaced during the earlier stages of the process, but this is where project planning takes over in earnest. There's so much more that goes into each step of the process. But even now, if you implement what you've learned today, you will strengthen your strategic decision-making capabilities. I hope this high-level overview of the core factors SMART decision process has helped you understand, 1, the importance of having a conscious and comprehensive process for making decisions. 2, how to solve the right problem at the right level. 3, how to gain support for the decision from the word go. And 4, how to ensure you've made the smartest decision possible. You may already be thinking about how to integrate this process into your decision making, and you have some questions you would still like to have answered, or you might want to have team members experience the process firsthand, and you'd like to know what would be involved in having that happen. If you're a leader who's facing an immediate, important decision, a decision where you've got to get it right the first time, but you don't have a lot of time to do so, you may have specific questions that you need answered right away. Or you might be the executive who's thinking longer term, and you want to make sure that the rest of your management team are well equipped to make important decisions in the future, and you'd like to know how to create a process that you can ensure that your entire senior team knows how to make really smart decisions, and you'd like to find out what's involved in that. Alternatively, you may be the individual who's simply frustrated with the current decision that you're trying to make, and you'd like to talk about some of the ideas that we've talked about today and how you could use those ideas to move your decision-making process along more effectively. Of course, it could be that all three of those scenarios apply to you. You may be facing an immediate decision of sizable importance, and you're frustrated with the process, and you also want to think longer term and equip people to be able to make decisions effectively that are strategic and that will advance your organization and its success over the longer term. Well, as a way of saying thank you for attending today, I'd like to offer you a special consultation time slot for free to answer any of the lingering questions that you might have and to review with you some of the issues that you are facing. If you're interested in connecting with me for that consultation so we can discuss your situation, I encourage you to drop me a line at scott@corefactors.com.